Are you dreaming about travelling again? I bet you are. So give yourself a break and listen to my brand new travel podcast. It's made for people like you, by people like you. And in these podcasts, there will be interviews with different types of travellers and the strange characters that I've met on the road, with stories and anecdotes from the last 32 years of my continuous backpacking and working around the world. Also, there'll be cynical destination descriptions and the occasional travel tip to smooth your journey. And for all the squeamish listeners out there, I just want to say that no studio was used or abused in the making of these podcasts or any of the recordings. So please check it out, and I hope you like it. Oh, and by the way, my name's Alan.
This week you have one of my stories. I've titled it South of Casablanca. This story took place some years ago, south of Casablanca in Morocco, in the month of June. My plan was to ride down the west coast of North Africa on my motorbike and into the Sahara Desert. With long, tiring days riding south, the journey had taken its toll on my body, and now my health was suffering. I seriously needed to stop, and for more than just a night, I needed to stop for a couple of days, if not more. Quietly and surreptitiously, I slipped into a dense wooded area between a long, wide, deserted beach, where the continuous pounding of the North Atlantic Ocean finally smashed down on the sand, and the distant drone of the traffic from a busy main road about 1.5 kilometres away behind me. With my stealthy camouflage tent erected and my motorbike under a camo tarp, I sat on my bag trying to fight off whatever was making me feel so bad. That night passed without problems, but I felt just as bad, if not worse, the next day when I woke. Feeling unusually lethargic, I now struggled to think straight as the temperatures climbed into the mid-40s. Reluctantly, I forced myself up and sat outside the tent again, light-headed and dehydrated. I sat there and stared at the ground again, my elbows resting on my knees. The trees shaded some of the penetrating sun, but the heat bounced off the sand into my face as though I was being cooked in a microwave. It pierced my skin like thousands of needles, and my motivation to do anything had evaporated in the heat. But I slowly made a small smokeless fire in a sandpit, then managed to cook and eat some rice, and I drank the starchy water too. There was absolutely no breeze to quell the oppressive heat. The sound of the crazy waves unceasingly crashing down on the beach 200 metres away echoed louder and louder in my ears. My head was spinning and my body was aching, and I remember that morning so well, and how the time dragged by under the canopy of the trees. When I suddenly felt something touch the side of my head, I froze. Instantly and instinctively I knew, because touching my temple was the barrel of a gun. Without moving a muscle, I saw that the person behind me wore heavy military boots and army fatigues. Yet I hadn't heard him approach through the trees or over the dead leaves and twigs. I pride myself on my awareness, but this took me by surprise. So I was shocked, but I didn't react. And inside my head I felt myself sigh with relief and apprehension, because this person behind me should be more disciplined than someone wearing flip-flops and shorts. Well, that's what I hoped. He motioned with the pistol for me to stand up, which I did. He hadn't said a word up to this point, but then he shouted something that sounded like Arabic. And 2 policemen wearing blue uniforms walked into my little camp. I stood there, my hands raised. With the military man just behind and slightly to my right, the 2 policemen stood in front of me, but away. The thought flashed across my mind that they could kill me here and now and nobody would ever know, the crashing waves easily muffling any gunshots. And it seems in Morocco that the police go around in twos, because there's always a good-looking one and an ugly one. Here the good-looking one had sharp greased-back hair and blue mirrored sunglasses, clear skin and a clean, neat uniform. His partner didn't have any sunglasses, only a mass of wild curly hair and his cap balanced precariously on top of it. His face was pockmarked and his uniform scruffy, but there were two other features about him that I think I should mention. His jaw jutted forward and his large ivory-stained teeth reminded me of a goat I'd seen a few days earlier. But it was the wide scar that ran from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth that sent shivers down my spine. Now I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, so what's it like having a gun pointed at you? What's going through your mind at a time like that? Well, let me tell you, it instantly focuses your mind and everything else fades, it disappears. Your attention and senses are ramped up to the max, and each second seems like forever. Even the deafening sound of the waves smashing against the beach drifted away. The good-looking cop said something to me in French. Well, before I started this journey, I taught myself to say, I don't speak French in French, but I never thought I'd have to use it. And very quickly I wish I hadn't. Because he said, yes you do, you just spoke French. I said, no, I learnt that. I certainly understood more than I spoke. My heart pounded and my brain raced. What do I say? He obviously doesn't speak English. I repeated it again, then stupidly followed it up with English, telling him that I don't speak French. It went like that, back and forwards in a circle, for a few seconds. Then he turned to his partner and said something. Immediately his colleague started going through all my bags, tossing my treasure stuff out onto the sand, one bag after another. The sand was littered with my clothes, cooking pots, bike spares and tools. He also tossed my diary into the sand along with my maps. I just assumed they were looking for drugs. He went through my bike jacket pockets, finding my last 2 Marlboro cigarettes in the pocket that I kept especially for bribing my way out of situations like this. I've never smoked. He tossed the packet to his boss, who revelled in the find. Out of the corner of my eye, I could just see the pistol and the hand holding it, when something bizarre caught my attention. There was sellotape wrapped around the gun barrel, which was starting to peel off. Imaginary scenarios flashed in my head. If he pulls the trigger now, would the barrel split apart? Meanwhile, I watched the ugly one rummage around inside my tent, but I knew there was nothing in there. Disgruntled, he kept searching. While this was going on, the guy holding the gun had gradually moved around a little more to watch what was happening, and for the first time I was able to see him fully. He was about 40 years old. He was dressed in drab khaki fatigues and with a black handlebar moustache and neat black hair. Seeing him actually gave me some sort of weird confidence. A confidence I didn't have for these 2 policemen, who were now talking in whispers to each other, which is always unnerving. Then once again in French, the boss said something about me having to leave in an hour, pointing at his watch, but his eyes and his words were directed to me via the soldier with the pistol. And like everything else he did, he was full of aggression and malice. And it crossed my mind that he was the sort of cop that would take pleasure in torturing you. And he'd be smiling while he's doing it. They started to walk off when the chief cop turned back almost like an afterthought and said what I took to be an order to snub out the last few embers that were still alight in the sandpit. Then they disappeared back into the trees, and they were gone. Instantly, the military man waved his gun at me to start packing. He tapped his pistol barrel on his watch, indicating he was counting. I kicked sand over the ashes, filling in the pit. Unknown to them, This usually would take me 2 hours, maybe more, when I break camp at 5:30 a.m. on a cool morning before the sun has risen to pack and load my bike. And even then, it's blisteringly hot the moment the sun penetrates the trees around 7 a.m. Now they were giving me an hour. It's 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. It's scorching hot and I feel like crap. Working as hard and as fast as possible, I started picking things up and shaking the sand off and ramming them into the bags. And it crossed my mind, what's going to happen if I don't get finished in time? This was a race against all odds, not just the clock. The sound of the raging ocean was now filling my ears again, along with my sweat. The harder I worked, the more sweat poured off me. It was like being under a hot shower and was now filling up my boots. And only 20 minutes in, I felt exhausted, losing energy quickly in the heat and weaker by the second. I was continuously blinking to try and clear the hot sweat running into my eyes that was stinging them. But it didn't seem to help. In my peripheral vision, I could see the soldier squatting down on the sandbank, looking down on me, the gun casually pointing in my direction. Sweat just poured off my body, soaking everything I touched. Luckily, I'd done this routine 1,000 times before. I could almost do it with my eyes shut, knowing what went where and which bag went on what part of the bike, but I'd never had to do it in such extreme hot, humid conditions and in such a short time. Everything had its place. For example, something as simple as the cooking pots had to be placed one inside the other correctly, otherwise they'd never fit into the bag. And in the last pot I'd pack the rice. As I feverishly worked, my focuses and senses had become more and more acute as my strength vanished. The slightest movement or sound made me jump or jerk my head to see what it was. I scrambled about in the loose sand to drop my tent as quickly as possible and slide it into the bag, and by now the scalding sweat in my boots had made my feet feel like they were on fire. I stacked the bags on the bike in the same order as I always did, but this time without the precision to balance them properly, and unable to tie them on tightly as I normally would because my hands were slippery and I just didn't have the energy. He suddenly stood up, which got my immediate attention. I swung my head in his direction and he motioned with his pistol. It was time to go. Go now. But I still have things to do, a voice inside my head screamed out. As I stared at him in total disbelief for that split second, he once again tapped the gun barrel on his watch. I wiped the sweat from my eyes and he was closer now, and I saw that I still had 10 minutes left. But I was finished, and according to him I was, because he had the gun. I threw my heavy bike jacket on and instantly the sleeves filled with sweat. My whole body was fried, weak and soaked through, almost as I'd been standing for hours in the Indian monsoon rains without an umbrella. I stood there dumbfounded for a second like an idiot, almost in shock, and I felt so utterly exhausted and betrayed. I feebly grabbed the remaining things and stuffed them into my small backpack and wrestled it onto my shoulders. Slid the helmet onto my arm, grabbed the handlebars and pushed with all my strength. But it was like trying to push an elephant upstairs. It just didn't move. The soldier was still shouting out, out while waving the pistol, but I had absolutely no strength left in me to shift the bike out of the sand. I felt resigned. If he'd have shot me now, I would have been grateful. The weight of the bike had sunk into the sand. The rims were buried and it was bogged down. I flicked my head around to see him start getting impatient and angry. Quickly I turned back and pushed again, the sweat never ceasing to cascade off me like rain, continuously running down my skin, under my clothes, inside my jacket, inside my boots. I pushed hard and stumbled, but quickly stood again. Surprisingly, this time the bike shot forward. I swung around and saw the gun-toting soldier pushing me out of the deep sand and on through the trees. He only stopped pushing when the bike tipped over the edge and rolled down the bank to the narrow track below. But being so weak and drained, I struggled to keep the bike upright. And down on the track, the badly positioned bags on the back made it want to fall over, even on the side stand. I switched the ignition on and got blurry red and green dash lights through the water in my eyes. I tentatively stabbed the starter button and it crackled into life. I sucked in some fresh air and sighed deeply, then donned my helmet. For the first time in the last hour, I'd felt relief. I would live to fight another day, to see another sunrise. Now I had another problem. I found I couldn't get my leg over the saddle. I had 4 pathetic attempts and just managed it on the 5th one. I didn't even have the strength to hold the bike upright once I was on it. The balance on the back was way off and it wanted to slide under me at the slightest movement. Never before in my whole life had I ever felt like that. In my mirrors, I could see the military man standing on top of the bank with his pistol and officer's moustache, looking down on me with his arms folded and his legs apart like some superhero from a movie. And he'd fixed me with a nasty Bollywood stare. Finally straddling the bike and rolling on the throttle, I made it to the end of the track, leaving the man with the gun behind. I could see him in my mirrors still, standing there, but I'd soon be gone, and he'd be out of sight, but not out of mind. Then turning right, I went onto the narrow strip of tarmac that would take me to the main road and away from all this shit. Everything within my vision was still very blurry. The dash, the front wheel, the road surface, even the white thin lines on the black asphalt. And I still struggled and fought with the bike all the way up towards the main road. It was about 1 kilometre ahead, maybe a bit more, up to the T-junction. I quickly came up with a plan to stop just before the main road to restack and tie my bags on properly and catch my breath, where I'd be out of sight of the soldier. It occurred to me that in less than an hour I'd done more than I would have done normally in 2.5 hours. And I'd pushed myself and exhausted myself in situations before, but nothing comes close to this. As I neared the main road, I started searching for somewhere to pull over, but then something in front of me caught my eye. Or rather someone was waving their arms trying to get my attention. Shock and horror passed through me like a streak of lightning. It was the 2 policemen. They were waiting for me. And well before I got there, I started blinking furiously to try and clear my eyes. I could just make out that they'd stopped the heavy traffic in both directions, for me, and they were both smiling and laughing and waving and cheering. It was like they were my friends now. And they all had big smiles. The ugly one had the biggest smile, with the biggest teeth. I was thrown for a minute. I couldn't work out what was happening. The physical exhaustion had robbed me of rational thought and quick thinking. In front and to my left, holding back the traffic, was the good-looking cop, who gestured, "Which way?" with a question mark on his face. The ugly one was on the right, on the far side of the main road. Instinctively, I cranked the bike over to the right and so nearly dropped it as I turned south and away from Casablanca. As I did, my bike jerked sharply around the corner onto the main road. My deprived brain was spinning with confusion as I tried to absorb and work out what was going on now. With adrenaline and now anger surging through my blood, I gunned the bike just to get away for what seemed like ages. Then out of sheer frustration and confusion, I slowed, I stopped the bike and unceremoniously leant it against a tree out of sight of the main road and devoid of all traffic noise. I slumped down, my back against a rock, totally bewildered and exhausted. Totally exhausted. The silence was deafening. From start to finish, the whole episode must have lasted less than 60-70 minutes. No longer. That moment left me instinctively wary and apprehensive whenever I saw a Moroccan police uniform. Even worse if there was a group. Soldiers just made me cautious because to some degree they had more discipline. Yet there's still one question that has been nagging me for all these years. And it's never gone away. Even to this day, I still ask myself, how on earth did this military soldier get to me without me hearing him?
Well, that's all for this week, folks. And please remember, the same road can be travelled 1,000 different ways, so get out there and make it your own. Until next week.